Hello and welcome to Disclosure. I am your host for today's program, Jean Boonstra, and I am delighted to meet with you again wherever you are listening, whether you're at home or you're listening in the car or wherever you are. We're just delighted to visit with you again and study God's Word together. I have a very special guest that will be joining me by phone here in the studio in just a minute. Someone who survived a harrowing experience that made him see his world very differently. And it was an experience that forever showed him that God is in complete control of his life, no matter the circumstances. And recently I taught a seminar on the parables of Jesus. And one of the parables that I focused on was the Good Samaritan. That's a favorite parable of mine, and I'm sure it's a favorite for you who are listening, many of you who are listening. And in that small group, we studied the parable and, of course, the actions of the priest, the Levite, and ultimately the Samaritan to the injured traveler. And at the beginning of the seminar, I handed everyone a little card. It was a little postcard size card. And after we studied the parable together, I asked everyone to write down the name of someone in their life that they felt was an injured traveler, someone that they would pass to the other side of the road to avoid, maybe in reality or figuratively. Someone that they wanted God to heal a wound or some sort of hatred with so that they could treat this injured traveler the way that the Samaritan in the parable treated the injured traveler. Well, we prayerfully filled out the cards, and I offered to take back to our office anyone's card that wanted to share it with me. I promised that we'd add their card to our weekly prayer list here at the Voice of Prophecy. Every Thursday morning, we begin our day here at the Voice of Prophecy with a circle of prayer. And so several individuals handed me their cards and asked that I take it back to our prayer group. And after the seminar ended, I looked at the stack of cards and I noticed several things that I expected. Many individuals wrote down that the injured traveler was an ex-daughter-in-law, an ex-husband, a family member that they had some struggles with. These people, they wanted healing from those wounds. But several of the cards had something on them that I did not expect. The people in the seminar wrote down terrorists. They thought of terrorists in that blanket term, that blanket term we use for a huge group of unknown people, really. They wanted to have compassion for these individuals just as the Samaritan did for the injured traveler. And that surprised me. I did not expect that, but it was a good surprise. And my guest today had a personal encounter unlike anyone in that seminar is likely to ever experience, at least I pray so. He was kidnapped by the Taliban. And my guest is Dr. Dilip Joseph. He is a medical doctor located right here in our beautiful state of Colorado, and he serves as medical director of Morning Star Development. He oversees public health, preventative health, and clinical projects in rural medical clinics in Afghanistan, and he provides access to those without health care options. And in 2012, Dr. Joseph was working in Afghanistan as a humanitarian aid worker when he was captured by the Taliban. He is the author of the book Kidnapped by the Taliban, a story of terror, hope, and rescue by SEAL Team 6, which I just had the pleasure of reading. I just finished it up this morning, in fact, and it is a riveting story of faith and hope. And Dr. Joseph is husband to Celicia and father of 5 children. Dr. Joseph, welcome to Disclosure. We're glad you're here with us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you guys.
Your story is riveting, and I know it's going to be an encouragement to those who are listening today who aren't familiar with it. Let's begin in 2012. In December of that year, you and 2 business associates were kidnapped by the Taliban while in Afghanistan. Let's begin with you explaining to us, why were you in Afghanistan?
So by 2012, I had already been working with this group called Morning Star Development for about 4 years, and my work with them started just with going to rural parts of Afghanistan and overseeing some medical projects we were doing in these parts. As you can probably imagine, these are areas that were highly, I would say, negatively impacted by the Taliban regime, and lack of very simple primary health care had ruined the health care for many of these communities. So I was really enjoying my time out to train local doctors and also give some training to community health workers and other medical professionals in these type of rural settings in Afghanistan.
Okay. And the organization that you were there with, that you still work with, Morningstar Development, is an NGO, so non-government organization. And from reading your book, I saw that you had a passion to do humanitarian work from a very young age, didn't you?
Yes, I was very fortunate to be brought up in a Christian family, and at a very young age made a decision to do this type of work by using medicine as my platform, and had the fortune of doing public health in Loma Linda University, and really that set up that background set me up to do this type of work in developing settings.
Very nice. Okay. Now, when you were originally stopped, were the kidnappers aware that you were an American?
I don't think that they were, and that's partly due to my ethnic background of being Indian and not although not from Afghanistan, part of that overall area, South Asian region. And so until they actually got a hold of my American passport, they wouldn't have been aware of the fact that I was a U.S. citizen.
Okay. So let's think about the events of the day. You're over there, you're doing humanitarian work, which you'd already been doing for 4 years. Am I remembering right that you had lunch with another doctor in your community prior to being stopped?
Yeah, so usually our day out in a rural area would comprise of going out to a clinic that we help run and spending the morning with the local healthcare workers, and then most often than not, we would end up at a local leader's or tribal elder's home for lunch. And so this time was no different. We had lunch at a local tribal elder's house, which we had in that location many times. I believe I had probably been to that community about 10 times in my 4 years of various visits. And so right after lunch, so my two colleagues, one a medical director, a local guy, and our driver were the two business associates that were with me. And so as we were making our way out of the tribal elder's home after lunch is when we were making our way down the mountainous terrain, down to the highway that would then take us towards Kabul. Not too far from our own community center is when the actual stopping happened.
Okay. And so this was a fairly routine day for you, something that you regularly did. You said you'd visited that area perhaps as much as 10 times before. So probably there was no reason to feel any alarm. What actually happened when you were stopped?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I didn't necessarily think that this trip would be any different than the previous 9, although having said that, there had been increasing sense of insecurity in that region. The more rural a place tends to get, the more you think about these matters, and the more it is possible that insurgents or fundamental groups are impacting that society or that community, that rural community. So we had heard some rumors of possible insurgents kind of visiting the community and kind of infiltrating the community, if you will. And but in the back of your mind, you're thinking, well, it couldn't happen to you until you see the first gunman and realize wow, today is going to be different than the previous visits.
What was your sort of gut reaction when this gunman did step out in front of your vehicle and confronted you?
You think of many other events that have gone wrong. Luckily, I've had no associates at least at that point back in 2012 that have experienced this, but many other colleagues of other NGOs who've gone through this type of events, and it simply becomes a roadside robbery. And sometimes I shouldn't say simply, but most of the time, what ends up happening is the robbers are one way or another connected to some insurgency groups. That's just how it happens in areas like this, and they end up looting and then killing these workers, even if they are foreign or even local NGO workers. And so that's what I feared when I saw the gunmen. I realized, wow, this is now my turn to experience this.
Oh, dear. So you feel immediately that your life is in danger, clearly. So pretty quickly, though, this gunman is joined by others, and they walk us through we just have 2 minutes before our first break, but just tell us what those initial first steps, where did they take you and what did they do?
Yeah, although we only saw one gunman in the beginning, we were quickly surrounded by two who were running down the hill in front of us and one from the back. So they had essentially surrounded us. So the initial 10 minutes or so by that roadside were very, very difficult. I could actually hear my heartbeat. It was that loud and fast. They put us back into our own vehicle, took us to a very remote area by the mountain ranges, not too far from where we were initially gathered, and that essentially started our day of hiking up and down mountains, which ended up being about 9.5 hours of hiking for the rest of the day.
Wow! And so your heart is racing. You're with two individuals who are part of your organization. They can communicate with your captors, but just the sheer panic almost would have been the natural reaction for most of us. But we're going to take a short break, and I want to hear how you responded in that harrowing experience and what it was like for you, and how your Christian faith really sort of influenced your reaction in that difficult situation that I hope no one listening has ever experienced. But we are here at Disclosure. We are talking to Dr. Dilip Joseph. He is the author of Kidnapped by the Taliban, a story of terror, hope, and rescue by SEAL Team 6. We are going to take just a short break, but we will be right back to hear more of this story here on Disclosure in just a moment. Disclosure is just one of the programs brought to you by the Voice of Prophecy, like the audio adventure program Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a weekly Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy faith-building stories with Jake Donovan, Mr. Simon, and others in this small mountain town. Each summer, campers visit Discovery Mountain, where they sing songs, learn about God, and reenact a Bible story with the help of drama teachers Miss Wendy and Miss Tamara. With 24 full episodes every year and programming every week, your family will have something uplifting to listen to every week. Listen to episodes on demand and watch video features from Director Doug at discoverymountain.com or on your favorite podcast platform. That's discoverymountain.com. Welcome back to Disclosure. I'm Jean Boonstra, and my guest for today on our program is Dr. Dilip Joseph. He's the author of the book Kidnapped by the Taliban, a story of terror, hope, and rescue by SEAL Team 6. And Dr. Joseph has shared with us the harrowing experience from 2012. And we left off just before the break, Dr. Joseph, with you describing what it was like for an armed man to meet your vehicle you and two associates were traveling in. They're in Afghanistan as humanitarian aid workers. And then they quickly got in the vehicle with you, and then you said you began a 9-hour hike through the mountains. How did you respond in that situation?
Yeah, so as soon as we had stopped the vehicle in, again, a very remote area close to some mountains, we started hiking up the initial part when my colleagues and I still had our hands tied behind our backs. Mm-hmm. But we then took a quick break, initial break, when we were actually joined by 5 or so extra people from maybe this insurgency mm-hmm. network. So initially we had four of the gunmen, mm-hmm. and then it was a pretty large group in the very beginning. And then as soon as they split in various different ways, we were left with 3 gunmen and 3 of us. And there started the rest of the real, captivity journey, if you will. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And those initial moments were very difficult for me because, reality was beginning to set in. That yes. This is a serious situation. Nothing much had been told to us in terms of what they were thinking of doing, whether it was just a random, capture event mm-hmm. where they're just going to kill us, or where they're looking at some ransom. Mm-hmm. So not knowing a lot of things just kind of leaves you with nothing but an opportunity to pray, if you will, and that's exactly what I ended up doing. I just had a feeling of I didn't want to be, pardon the phrase, I didn't want to be pissed off mm-hmm. while about to be killed, So I really mm-hmm. wanted to take those last moments of really recollecting God's goodness in terms of what I had been able to experience in my life till that moment. Mm-hmm. So I just went through a time of just first of all, asking a lot of questions about why this is happening, and then going into a time of praising God for everything that I've been able to experience so far. And that was such a beautiful moment of internal praise and worship. I even began to sing some songs that I had known from early childhood. About God's goodness and how He's so faithful in our journeys. And I think that was a switch in my own mind of really setting up the tone for how I would end up handling the next 4 days or so. Okay.
So you're literally at this point, your hands are still tied behind your back, and you're hiking up through this remote mountainous area. 3 of you, 3 gunmen, so 1-to-1, and you're able to praise God. That's beautiful. That's really powerful, and setting that tone for what you would experience as well. God was with you. So how well coordinated was this kidnapping?
When in hindsight, I would say it was a really well coordinated effort.
Okay.
But then now also, especially thinking about the initial phases, but now mm-hmm. looking at how it all panned out, I don't know how they could have done anything different, because this is really a routine way they go about. excuse me. Mm-hmm. They go about these type of kidnapping and then negotiation aspect of kidnapping, and not having had a lot of experience at that time of even knowing how they do this, I thought they were doing a pretty good job in keeping up with the routine of the moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So in the book, you describe how you've done this hike, and if I recall correctly, I think you and one of the gentlemen were dressed in somewhat comfortable shoes. The other one of your business associates was actually in dress shoes, and so I just felt so sorry for him, not only having to go through this experience, but just the physical suffering of having to do that huge hike with that psychological pressure in dress shoes. And in the book, you describe how originally your captors asked for a $2 million ransom. And then that sort of changed, and they asked for $300,000 as a ransom. And at different points, this kind of changed. What were the Taliban members trying to gain from your kidnapping?
I think in many of these situations, they are just looking for money, essentially. Okay. And because of the tribal and sub-tribal nature of these region and different provinces and districts, if you will, then it becomes almost a tribe-on-tribe warfare. And we kind of experienced that over the next 3 or 4 days. But essentially, many of these smaller network then become part of the bigger network, and it just connects all the way up to the Taliban headquarters in Waziristan in Pakistan. So we got to get a deeper look, if you will, to the entire network and how it all works, from even a very small rural village connecting all the way up to the international level, and how these networks work and why they do what they do.
Okay. So they hike you through this remote area. You end up spending a night in sort of a shack. You keep hiking the next day. When you get to your destination, the place you spent the majority of your time, how did your captors treat you?
I would say overall their treatment was better than I actually expected. And one of my prayers during the first day was, if this is actually an opportunity that God has sovereignly allowed me to experience, then I need to be, first of all, in a state of mind to be able to just interact with them as well as I can. So I think that prayer was answered in the second day with some really deeper engagement in terms of just interaction between this one specific what seemed to be a young guy involved in this group named Wallach, and many questions directed specifically to me. And certainly the rest of them on that second day, there were 4 of them in this shack, a slightly better put together shack than the previous one where we spent the night before or the end of the first night. And I was surprised at how open they came across in terms of wanting to know something about a foreigner, in spite of maybe a lot of perceptions they might have about people and life outside of their own areas. It was very engaging, and I didn't necessarily expect that, but at the same time, as I said, it was such an answer to prayer.
So, yes, I mean, I think we all, when we hear of stories of an individual being kidnapped or captured, we have a set of assumptions. And then when you hear of an individual captured by the Taliban, we probably add additional assumptions to those we have already to a kidnapping and our captors. But your captors really treated you with a lot of dignity. I was touched particularly when you described the role that their cultural hospitality played and the tea service that they had with you. Can you describe that a little bit for us?
You know, Afghans are known for their incredible hospitality, and I've been I've experienced this in direct ways in having had the opportunity to travel to about 12 out of the 34 provinces within Afghanistan. And I've never, once you kind of get used to it, I've never been surprised at the depth and the level of hospitality. They have a beautiful proverb in their own language where they talk about how they meet someone, a stranger, the first time they are friends, but the second time we meet, we're brothers. And they really live up to that proverb, just in the way it's very, very Jewish in its origins. Going back to Leviticus or Deuteronomy, where a lot of laws are set about treating foreigners or foreigner in your land,
Right.
And they keep up to those traditions. You have to kind of appreciate the fact that many of these folks were either Jewish or maybe animist nomadic tribes before Islam came into their culture, maybe only about a millennia ago. So. So that's really interesting in the way they continue to propagate their culture and have their cultural activities.
So even there in this remote area, a cloth was laid out, naan bread was provided, and hot tea was served. And what I found fascinating was that you and your two business associates actually sat around the food and ate the food with your captors. You shared that meal together.
Yeah, that is so normal to them. And
Okay.
there's an unfortunate joke among international aid workers in Afghanistan that even being captured by the Taliban is another way of them showing their hospitality, which I don't now find funny whatsoever. But
Right.
It's interesting that even in that type of what would come across to us as a very, very difficult for an outsider, a very difficult thing to experience. For them, it's an opportunity to explore the life and the mindset of someone who is outside of their culture.
Okay.
So they, in some ways, in spite of the geopolitical tensions and religious and cultural differences, they tend to just utilize any moment to get to know, irrespective of how an event might turn out.
Okay.
Get to know about the foreigner, and they just go about their life, and part of that life is having a lot of tea, every couple of hours.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that hospitality certainly played a role, and you got to actually know and have some deep conversations with your captors. And we're going to take a short break, and I want you to share with our listeners some of those conversations you were able to have right after the break. So you are listening to Disclosure. I'm Jean Boonstra. We'll be right back after this short break with Dr. Dilip Joseph and more of his story about being kidnapped by the Taliban. Are you searching for answers to life's toughest questions? Like, where is God when we suffer? Can I find real happiness? Or is there any hope for our chaotic world? The Discover Bible Guides will help you find the answers that you're looking for. Visit us at BibleStudies.com or give us a call at 888-456-7933 for your free Discover Bible Guides. Study online on our secure website or have the free guides mailed right to your home. There is never a cost or obligation. The Discover Bible Guides are our free gift to you. Find answers in guides like Does My Life Really Matter to God? And A Second Chance at Life. You'll find answers to the things that matter the most to you. Visit BibleStudies.com and begin your journey today to discover answers to life's deepest questions. Welcome back to Disclosure. I'm Jean Boonstra, your host for today's program, and my guest is Dr. Dilip Joseph, who has been sharing his experience of being captured by the Taliban while working as a humanitarian aid worker in Afghanistan back in 2012. And Dr. Joseph, you were able, in this harrowing circumstance, to not only have peace, but to have answers to prayer, to actually be able to connect with your captors at a human level. You had a deep conversation with this individual, this young man named Wallach, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And if I remember correctly, he started by asking you about where you met your wife. Can you tell us about that conversation you were able to have with him?
Yeah, that's right. I remember even as he started a sequence of questions that ended up being like a 3-hour conversation, he was so polite enough to ask me permission whether I would answer his questions. And that was the first question he laid out there. And I certainly was so open to that. So I said, I'm an open book. Ask me any questions you want. And the very first question, as you just mentioned, was a question about where I had met my wife, which is not what I expected, from an active Taliban. And then he asked me as a follow-up question to that whether I loved her today as much as I loved her the very first time I met her. Wow. Which was very interesting to me. That it's only later on, as he was asking me more questions about my own family, my parenting, how many children we had. We had 4 kids at that time, and then my own upbringing, and that just went on and on and on for maybe even close to an hour and a half or so.
He asked you about your cousins. I mean, he got into detail, didn't he? Yeah.
Well, at that time I had begun to wonder whether he was just trying to get a good feel about my family setup, or whether I come from a well-to-do, financially well-to-do family. Yeah, but then the more questions he asked, it really sounded very genuine, and I could sense that since I had many other opportunities like this to reference to in rural Afghanistan, I knew that this was just part of getting to know me. For him, it was a matter of, why is this guy different than me? I really want to know. And the more he asked, I just kept praying inside that I would have an opportunity to then get to know about him. And almost as soon as I could even finish that thought, he started reflecting back to me about how different his life is. And some of those statements choke me up even to this day. And some of those things that he mentioned is, you do what you do because this is what your parents have taught you. And I do what I do because this is all I've seen all around me. Then he went on to talk about how he had started becoming part of the same insurgency group when he was just 4 years old.
Oh, dear.
And by the time he was 5, he had already killed his first victim. And I'm sitting there trying to get a feel for what that actually means in reality. Knowing myself having kids at that age, at that time, a 9-month-old, a 3-year-old, a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, how that is not even fathomable in my mind.
Sure.
And yet, here's a young man who then goes on to give all of us a feel for how old he actually was, because he went on to say that for the past 14 years he hadn't seen his father because his father had been in prison. At that moment, it hit me right away that he was only 19 years old. And I stopped him right there and I said, I can't believe you're only 19 years old. You're old enough to be, or I'm old enough to be your father. And I noticed that that moment was just one of the few seconds he took a deeper breath, and he was just sort of processing what that actually means. And then he went on to state some very profound insights about what he really wanted to make out of his life, and stating things like, could I start my life all over again? Could you take me to America? Which was a very interesting question for me, knowing very well that an Afghan Taliban insurgent or any sort of fundamental insurgent would not at all have that opportunity. I certainly wanted to keep the conversation moving forward, and I said, absolutely, let's see how we can logistically make that happen. And I was going into this logical framework of you need to go get a passport, you need to apply for an American visa, and he stops me mid-sentence and he says, you might not believe this, I've never even gotten out of my own village, let alone been to Kabul, which is the capital city, and he happened to sort of mention how far it was, which gave me an idea of essentially where we were sitting at that
located.
moment. Exactly. And so those type of conversation to get an insight into, how perhaps a 15-year veteran of the Taliban insurgency is thinking, made me realize that my framework for these guys didn't quite fit into the reality of what any of us on the outside might consider these guys to experience or dream about, or even aspire, even in the midst of all that hopelessness that they experience on a daily basis.
To aspire for something different, a different life from what they were experiencing in that moment.
Essentially what he was saying was, I know there is much more to my life than what I get to experience. So tell me about how life could be, because I want something better.
That surprised me. I really have to admit that did surprise me.
It surprised me as well. Sitting and listening to it, I was like, wow, this is what I've heard about, but this is not what I expected.
It just shows, we have a 19-year-old daughter. Her friends, the guy friends that are the same age as this young man was when you had that experience, those are things that I think they normally think about. And so it just really does show the common things that we go through, each of us as humans. And you're being able to connect with your captors and have those conversations about family, about hopes, about dreams. Do you believe that they were also able to see you more just as a fellow human as well, not maybe with that $sign on your forehead?
That's right. Yeah.
I
think the more you're able to interact with people from an outsider, perhaps someone who doesn't necessarily fit into your your own realm of influence, or people that you tend to connect with, I feel like first of all my paradigm had opened up wider, and I also realized that it could be very sinful to think about certain people or people group, even if they are considered enemies as such, and put them in a category that probably God doesn't necessarily put them in. And that's a moment that really got to me as I was having these deeper conversations.
Wow. So you're there. You're in a remote part of the mountains. You've made connections with people back at your organization. They, at different points, your captors gave you a phone to make phone calls to request money for your ransom to be paid. So you've had a tiny bit of communication back and forth. You're staying in a shack. Actually, you discovered it was a mosque, didn't you? Very simple, but it was actually a mosque.
Yeah, I wouldn't have actually figured that out if it wasn't for somewhat of an intense conversation my two colleagues were having with these guys.
Okay.
And essentially the conversation was about how can you call yourself Muslims when you capture people and hold them captive in a local mosque. So that's what gave that away, because in spite of not having what you would expect a mosque to look like, they did have a Quran wrapped in a very, very nice cloth and left in this mud shelf in one corner of this room.
Okay.
And that's what gave it away to my colleagues as well.
Okay, that makes sense. So you're there, and as I'm reading your story, of course, I can't help thinking about what it's like for your wife and your children back at home, and what communication was taking place with your family back in the U.S. while all of this was going on.
Yeah, so it was essentially the morning of that second day, my time in Afghanistan, that the organization decided to actually meet with my wife, because at that time, although it had been 12 hours or 18 hours after the original capturing happened, they wanted to be certain that we were not just held up in a rural area and just spending the night there for whatever reason, not being able to get back to Kabul. And so once they heard from us and knew for certain this was happening, they did make the communication with my wife. And as you can imagine, very, very difficult, especially as she was then told not to share this news, just because, it could get out to the media, social media, any of that, platform, which would make it much more difficult for us in that setting. And so I think carrying that and keeping that information to herself, not being able to share with others, even for prayer, was very, very heavy for her to deal with for the next 2 to 3 days.
Yeah, so she's there, and she probably had feared such a phone call as this, but I'm certain you went to Afghanistan with her blessing. You obviously this was and is a passion for both of you as a family. So you always knew that was a risk, but as you described in the beginning, you never actually think it's going to happen to you. That's the difference. So you're there for 4 days. The psychological torture, knowing that you could be killed at any time, must have been very difficult. You were not really physically harmed, which I'm sure you praise God for to this day. But as you're there for 4 days with these individuals, and various things happen, and you were rescued by SEAL Team 6. That's a huge part of your story. And so right after this break, I want to hear about that rescue, hear what it was like for you, hear what it was like for your family, and sort of how that whole reintegration and how you adapted back to regular life after that, what that experience was like, Dr. Joseph. So we're going to take a short break. You're listening to Disclosure. I'm your host, Jean Boonstra. We'll be right back to hear more of this story with Dr. Dilip Joseph, when he was kidnapped by the Taliban in Afghanistan. We'll be right back.
Are you searching for answers to life's toughest questions like, where is God when we suffer? Can I find real happiness? Or is there any hope for our chaotic world? The Discover Bible Guides will help you find the answers you're looking for. Visit us at BibleStudies.com or give us a call at 888-456-7933 for your free Discover Bible Guides. Study online on our secure website or have the free guides mailed right to your home. There is never a cost or obligation. The Discover Bible Guides are our free gift to you. Find answers in guides like, Does My Life Really Matter to God? And A Second Chance at Life. You'll find answers to the things that matter most to you in each of the 26 Discover Bible Guides. Visit BibleStudies.com and begin your journey today to discover answers to life's deepest questions.
Welcome back to Disclosure. I'm Jean Boonstra. My guest today, Dr. Dilip Joseph, has been sharing with us his experience of being kidnapped by the Taliban back in 2012. He spent 4 days as their hostage while working there as a medical doctor and a humanitarian aid worker. So, Dr. Joseph, tell us about your rescue, the arrival of SEAL Team 6, and just what that rescue was like.
Well, what I can remember is it all happened so fast, and that was the last thing on my mind. You know, the third and fourth day got so intense in terms of negotiations. I remember thinking on the third day that it's essentially going to end up in them killing me and my colleagues, and then on the fourth day, it became more and more apparent that they were looking at taking us over to Pakistan. And that might have led the military to do what they did in terms of making sure that before these guys would transfer us and take us on land over to the border, where then the U.S. military does not have any jurisdiction, so to speak, they would essentially come for my rescue. But also by then, my two colleagues had been separated from me, and they were in another remote village, and I was on my own with five of these guys. Two of them still my original captors, and three more that had sort of been added. And the group, as you can imagine, had swelled from the original 3 to all the way to about 13 or so over the days. And then so when there was a bit of commotion going on in the early hours of the fifth day, again, I didn't know what to expect. And then when there was a gunfire, a shot that effectively killed the very first SEAL that walked into the room, you know, maybe a 1 in a million shot. Again, not knowing what was happening, then hearing my name being called out and me responding to that, I essentially had one of these SEALs laying on top of my body while he was effectively holding down the one more guy who was to the right of me, and then two guys who were to my left, and two laying kind of perpendicular at night while we were all sleeping. And it was probably less than 2 minutes while they had everyone around me shot while this guy was laying on top of me. And then within a matter of a few more minutes, taking me out of the room and standing outside for the helicopter to land.
So just incredibly quickly, and you were all sleeping in the room. Is that correct?
Yeah.
When they came in, so they had the equipment. These SEALs had equipment so they could see in the dark. I assume night vision goggles or something. So they come in, and the first SEAL to enter ends up losing his life. Wow. So he really he provided the ultimate sacrifice, didn't he?
That's right, yeah.
Although any one of them, if they had been first, they would have been willing of that SEAL team. It's just incredible. So the soldier that was laying on top of you then, he was shielding your body from what was happening in the room, so you would be protected.
That's right.
Yeah. So they take you in the helicopter, and then where do they take you?
They take me to the one military base that's well established right outside of Kabul.
Okay.
And they go through the re-acclimatization process of debriefing and seeing how I'm doing and coping with now the new reality of being rescued. And initially they tell me, this whole re-entry process could take 2 to 3 months, to which I just respond by saying, I've gone through an experience which just makes me want to see my family and just be with my family. And they go through the initial assessment, and I was lucky enough to be released the third morning from that base and travel straight back to the U.S.
Okay, you went straight back to the U.S. So there was a very intentional process, though, wasn't there, of the SEALs and a whole team of people that were there to make sure that you were okay, physically, emotionally, and that you were able to go back to your family.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing what the military, in conjunction with the State Department, the embassy, and then of course the specific aspects of Department of Defense, where whether it's a SEAL team or someone else that's involved, how they and maybe even the FBI. So all these guys, one of those guys were even joking with me later on, saying that he had never experienced how all these different factions of the government had worked so well in synchrony to make this happen.
Wow.
And I can imagine the level of investigation and lots of research to have to put all these pieces in play, including the president at that time, President Obama, having to make that call to the commander general at that point in Afghanistan, and then also making the decision along with the ambassador in Kabul.
So this really involved the highest levels of the government to pull off your rescue. Now, SEAL Team 6, they're a special group, aren't they? They also were involved in a mission in 2011.
Yeah, they are an incredible group of men that make it to the most elite part of the American military, and their level of commitment and teamwork, just a work ethic, is just beyond amazing. It's hard to imagine in our the average mindset what they go through, what they sign up for, what they have done for many military men, civilians. Over the past decade or so, I've later learned how much more SEAL Team 6 is used for civilian rescue, and also in specific efforts to target international criminals or folks of that nature.
So the two men that were with you, before your rescue, you were separated from them. Were they okay? Were they rescued as well?
Yeah, it was just an incredible providence for them as well to be rescued by the Afghan National Army, almost in sync with what was happening with my rescue. So I kept asking my rescuers, what was happening with my colleagues, the fact that I didn't know where they were, and they kept reassuring me that they're also taken care of. Of course, the details I only knew later on.
Sure. Do you keep in touch with them?
Yes. In fact, they got a lot of death threats following their rescue, and then subsequent going back to normal life, quote unquote. And they had to get out of the country for a good 5 or 6 months before they decided to go back in and continue their same work. So they, even to this day, they continue to work for Morningstar Development.
Wonderful.
And yes, we've been able to keep in touch in spite of me not being able to go back into Afghanistan.
Okay. Well, and that was a question I had for you, because at the close of your book, which 2014, you describe your decision to not return to Afghanistan following your capture. And, I have to tell you, I empathize with your wife and with your children. I felt a huge sigh of relief when I read that. I thought how difficult that would be for your family to experience you going back there. And so it sounds like that has been the case to this day. But do you plan to go back to Afghanistan?
My heart is there, given the number of friendships I've been able to forge and the type of work that continues there. But at the same time, I now have to be mindful of how much not only me being a target, but also my colleagues, anyone who's associated with me being a target as well.
Certainly.
And so, in spite of trying a couple of times, I haven't been able to attain visa to head back there. And that's been a good way of realizing, okay, God has a timing with all of this. And in spite of me wanting to be there, it's probably best for not only me, also for the organization and many others associated with our work, for me not to travel at this point.
Okay. You know, there's a definite pattern in your story, Dr. Joseph, and I thank you for sharing it. But the pattern that I saw was peace, prayer, faith, and hope. And of course, it reminded me of one of my favorite verses, which is Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. How has your experience changed how you view your faith?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I feel like in spite of us not necessarily wanting to experience this type of turmoil, any turmoil for that matter, I think God can sort of weave all these experiences to help us better understand our faith and our understanding of who God is and His work in the lives of people, across the globe. So for me, this has been a very interesting way of maybe even better understanding God's heart for even the lost, and also for people who you don't necessarily think of as people being loved by God. So my faith has increased in the sense that I can read the Bible in a new light. I can understand my faith in terms of God's greater love, not just for me, but also for anyone who I understand and whom I don't necessarily even want to understand, because they just don't fit into that paradigm that I would like to see them through, or that filter that I like to see them through. Right. So that's been a sort of reawakening factor in my own faith of having greater hope for the humankind.
Yeah, for humankind. Well, Dr. Joseph, God had His hand over you. He protected you for a purpose and for a reason. And I want to thank you for sharing your story with us here. And we want to wish you and pray for you that your humanitarian work there in Afghanistan will continue with God's richest blessings. Thank you for being with us.
Oh, thank you for the time.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us today. And I pray that Dr. Joseph's story will just be a testimony that will increase your faith as well. And if you're intrigued and you'd like to read the book, I highly recommend it. There are a lot of details here, a lot of richness that we weren't able to share in a 1-hour interview. And the book is called Kidnapped by the Taliban, A Story of Terror, Hope, and Rescue by SEAL Team 6. And if you're interested in that, certainly visit us at Disclosure at VOP.com and look for the Disclosure tab, and you will find all the information on where to find that book in our show notes. God really does have a plan for each of us. He has a plan for a future and a hope, and He has His hand over us just as He did Dr. Joseph. And so I pray that whatever situation you're finding yourself in right now, that He will give you the peace that you need. This has been Disclosure. I'm Jean Boonstra. Thank you for listening, and be sure to visit us online and join us again next time. God bless you.